So finding a comfortable position where your spine can be straight but not rigid. And notice how your legs and hands feel. If they're resting comfortably. And establish mindfulness. And notice how that changes your experience. Bring your attention to your breathing. And follow your in-breath into the body. Bringing your attention inwards. Relaxing as you breathe out. Can notice how the body feels. Might be warm or cold where you are. Quiet or noisy, but we just keep bringing the attention inside. Observe the in-breath from the beginning of it all the way till it ends and becomes an out-breath. If you bring your attention to the top of your head and then gradually move down to the eyes, noticing any tension around your eyes. To your nose and cheeks and mouth and chin, any any tightness or tension, letting it relax. Still aware of the in-breath and the out-breath through their whole cycle. But also any tension in the shoulders. Invite them to relax. Noticing how the abdomen feels, if it's soft or tight. We want to be alert, but we also want to be relaxed. We want to be straight, but we also want to be at ease. So using the muscles just enough to hold the posture. And let go of stress, tension. Any form of resistance, just breathe, invite it to fall away. If you find you're sitting in a way that's not quite comfortable, you can adjust mindfully. Really taking time, a little bit of time at the beginning to get settled and prepared for meditation. And observing the in-breath coming all the way into the body. You can imagine it filling the entire body. Observe the out-breath, knowing how long it is from the time it starts until you've completely exhaled. Not with any force or pressure, but just the natural outflow of the breath. And as you're breathing in and breathing out, aware of the in-breath and the out-breath, and start to feel the whole body breathing. The whole body is feeling the in-breath. The whole body is feeling the out-breath. aware of the whole body like this, and the in-breath and out-breath grounding us. Can notice sensations arising in the body, pleasant feeling perhaps. Can notice how relaxation feels to you. How it feels in the body when you turn your attention inwards. Noticing an inner silence. Even though it might be possible to hear sounds around you, turning our attention inwards changes our experience. Hearing is one of those things that's quite directional based on where we put our attention. You can even let my voice fade into the background if you wish. Staying present with your in and out breathing is enough. And allowing the process to unfold on its own. You might feel some tingling somewhere in the body, some warmth. Some sort of pleasant feeling. If you want to go deeper, feel more of that spiritual energy, then sharpen your focus on your breathing. But also in a way that's kind, gentle. When you notice pleasant feeling, then put extra attention there. Invite that feeling to spread through the body. As the Buddha said, like working the moisture into the bath powder. So the whole ball of powder is soaked. Work that feeling through the body. Calling it work might be a little misleading because it's really inviting it to spread, fueled by the quality of our intention, our mindfulness. And a tone of happiness and relief, joy. And if there are thoughts passing through the mind, just turn away from them, let them go. Invite the mind to become calm and tranquil. And like exterior sounds, thoughts can fade into the background. As we notice our breath, have our attention on our breathing, our body, our feeling. Feelings of joy, feelings of contentment, relaxation. thoughts comes back, if thoughts come back, then we can remind ourselves that that's not important right now. Right now is the time to rest in mindfulness and awareness. Happiness, joy, tranquility, stillness, and lucidity of mind. Hello, everyone, again. So today I'm going to respond to a request for a topic of talking about the five khandas, and I'll explain what that means for anyone who's new to this. But in particular, today we're going to talk about the body and how the Buddha encouraged us to use it and think of it. I'm going to share my notes with you, maybe in case, if you're an auditory learner, you don't have to look. But if you're a visual learner, you might want to see them. So here they are. So when we think about the five aggregates, it's a funny term. At first when we come to Buddhism, we don't quite know what that means, but the Buddha, as most of you know, was trying to help people see the way things actually are, and so much of our suffering comes from seeing things in a way that isn't actually realistic. So one thing to reflect on is, when I think of me, who I am, what is it that I think is included in that? And the Buddha talked about what's in Pali called the khandas. In Sanskrit, it's skandhas. And that word khanda has a few different meanings, but one of them is heaps. He's kind of trying to take those things that we think of as the self, as ourselves, the things we identify with, and just kind of sort them into heaps. I think of it like sorting laundry. You got the whites and the colors and the bulky items or whatever, and so one heap of things, of concepts, things that that's very easy to have a sense of, is form. Rupa is the Pali word, but it's the body and it's material objects. It's those things that are, the tangible parts. And then the Buddha, of course, also talked about feeling. We identify, these are the things we identify with and cling to. Feeling on our mental processes of perception and mental activity. You can see the word sankhara gets translated in different ways, as you know. Mental formations, mental activity, volitional formations, because there is an element of some kind of choice, or just plain choices, and consciousness. And I'm going to talk about these things in the next couple of meetings, unless something else interrupts this series, but I'm going to talk about these things in a bit more detail as we go along. But just, having that sense of, most of you are really familiar with this kind of framework, but how do you relate to it in an actual way, in your own mind, in your own life? Because if we're not free from suffering entirely, then we're still clinging to these kind of elements or aspects of what kind of forms up to look like a self, our self. So I'm going to look at a little bit of what Bhikkhu Bodhi talked about in his introduction to the Khanda Samyutta. So in the link to discourses in the Samyutta Nikaya, as you know, if you have any familiarity with it, there's a lot of books, individual topics of suttas or discourses. And there is a pretty hefty volume for, addressing these 5 aggregates of clinging, these 5 heaps of clinging, the Khanda, Samyutta. And in the introduction, you can read here, this is what Bhikkhu Bodhi said about the 5 aggregates. Examination of the 5 aggregates plays a critical role in the Buddhist teaching for at least 4 reasons. Said first, because the 5 aggregates are the ultimate referent of the first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering. And he gives a reference there of Samyutta Nikaya 56:13. And since all 4 truths revolve around suffering, understanding the aggregates is essential for understanding the 4 noble truths as a whole. So to really understand that basic framework that the Buddha came to on the night of his enlightenment of the 4 noble truths, recognizing that there is suffering, and the way I think is best to use that in a practical, immediate way is to notice the suffering we experience in the present moment. Or if we're experiencing suffering, that we acknowledge this is suffering. And then the Buddha said we should understand that suffering. And then when we understand that suffering, to acknowledge and recognize, oh, we understand it. So it's the first noble truth. And these heaps that represent maybe in our minds as a whole who we are, this is really where we feel the suffering. And we suffer because we want our body to be different than it is. We don't want this pain, or we don't want to engage in, the kinds of things we have to experience because of the body, even those things that come through the senses like heat and cold and noise and anything else that comes, basically through the senses of the body, can cause us suffering. But it's like the real cause, the Buddha will tell us, is how we're looking at things and where we're putting our attention. And so if we can recognize that this suffering can be, if we recognize that the cause of this suffering is in our attachment or clinging, our seeing things in a way that's not accurate, not the way they actually are, then that suffering can cease even if the conditions don't change. So, and then of course the Noble Eightfold Path to help us develop in a way that we are able to do this, to really put that clinging and craving down. So that's the first reason. If we can appreciate the aggregates and what the Buddha was trying to get at with that, then we can really understand the 4 noble truths. Secondly, because the 5 aggregates are the objective domain of clinging. So the Buddha said, these are the things to notice because these are the things we cling to. And as such, contribute to the causal origination of future suffering. So we not only do we suffer in the present moment, but by our actions, our choices, the things that we do, say, and even where we put our mind in thought, creates future suffering, sets some action in motion that comes back to us in a way to bring more suffering. So we keep on, noticing and looking at this kind of thing in order to bring our mind to a point where we can let that suffering go. So third, because the removal of clinging is necessary for the attainment of release, so we have to let go of the clinging. And the clinging must be removed from objects around which its tentacles are wrapped, namely the five aggregates. So this is what we're holding on to. And fourth, because the removal of clinging is achieved by wisdom, and the kind of wisdom needed is precisely clear insight into the real nature of the aggregates. So we talk about insight, and it's not just, this is not something we can know entirely by reasoning. The Buddha said that in many places. This is not just by mere reasoning that we can understand these things, but it's through insight, through wisdom that develops both by that kind of reasoning and really absorbing the teachings and living by them, but it also requires or will inevitably involve some breakthroughs, this clear insight into the nature of reality. Does anybody have any questions or comments so far? No?
Yeah, yeah, I do.
Okay. Yes.
Uh, about how thinking can lead to suffering, because thinking then leads uh, to an action, or it can lead to an action. I'm just thinking, how do you catch that part uh, where you've already entered the thinking that's going to later on? I mean, you can kind of feel, I can kind of feel it, um, but it almost seems like it happens imperceptibly. That suddenly I find myself, in unwholesome thinking or whatever.
Mhm.
Uh, that, yeah, that's,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the fact that you catch yourself while you're thinking rather than like putting it into action, that's a big step already.
well,
And
I often don't, but
well,
looking back, I think, oh, I should have caught it there.
yeah, this is the process of training the mind.
Okay.
Like there's that sutta of removal of distracting thoughts. I think it's number 20 in the middle length discourses. And the Buddha talks about those 5 ways of how to remove distracting or unwanted thoughts. And he's talking about in meditation, but it's applicable regardless of whether we're meditating or not. And then at the very end, he says, when you've trained yourself to do this completely, then you'll just be able to think what you want to think when you want to think it.
Hmm.
And that's pretty cool. I'm not there yet, I'm afraid. But you can catch it, and the best way to catch it is to train ourselves to be aware that when we start suffering, because those thoughts that will bring, you can check on this, and I will too. See if you think this is true, that those thoughts that are unwholesome, that will bring future suffering, maybe are already, um, companion to suffering in the present moment. Because, it's like when people are mean to each other, they're not happy. There's suffering there. And when we're thinking things that are unwholesome, either we're craving something, there's something we want, or there's something painful or just uncomfortable, something we want to get rid of.
Oh, right.
And so maybe, tuning into that more and more, like, am I content? So one of the things, that they do when you ordain is they give you a Pali name. So Santussika, and it's usually something to aspire to. My name means contentment. And if I use my name as a source of reflection, then I can ask myself, well, right now in this moment, am I content? And if I'm not, why not? And this is, just one way of 100 probably, that we can train ourselves to notice how is my mind right now. And when we think about the body, so much, it has such a huge impact on the mind, on our thinking, and working with the way the body feels and the things it goes through, how to do that without identifying with the body.
Can
So
I say
catch it
something?
whenever you can. Yes, go ahead, Denny.
Well, that part of like, so this thought doesn't come out of nowhere. The thought
Mhm.
comes out of, I'm already suffering. So it feels like I have a choice. I can either, if I'm meditating, just to let the thought go, just pass through me, or I could sort of examine where'd that thought come from? Am
Mhm.
I suffering? Well, but which do I do? Do I just,
Yeah,
is there
that's a
time
good
for
question.
examination and a time for letting go?
Yes, and it's something that we learn through experimentation and getting to know our own mind and our own patterns, our own history, because sometimes, you know, we it's very important to really look at a thought or a feeling. I mean, the thoughts bring feelings with them, or the other way around, almost instantaneously. And when strong feeling arises, it doesn't work. Many of you've heard me say this many times. It doesn't work to just say I'm going to just shove that under the rug, because it requires some attention generally. But it might be a pattern that you've looked at many times, and you understand the root of it. You understand your own history. You've seen this same experience again and again, and acknowledging it and determining not to follow it is enough. So it's something we really learn. And a lot of, the thoughts that pop into our mind, because this is all because of old karma, right? So things in the past, whatever they were, whatever lifetime it was, doesn't matter, but they pop into our mind. That doesn't mean we have responsibility for that, but we have responsibility for what we choose to do with it now. And if some thought about something someone did to us that was mean or unkind or rude or whatever in the past, if that thought pops into our mind, and then we go with it and we build up a certain resentment or anger, or we keep something alive that's actually really suffering, then we've put energy into it. Then we create new karma for the future.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Denny.
Mhm.
Any other comments, questions? Okay. So when we talk about the body, there, the sutta that I'm showing a very short snippet of on the screen right now is the second discourse that the Buddha gave after his enlightenment on not self. It's called the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta. And it's also in this same section of the linked discourses. Samyutta Nikaya 22 is the book on the aggregates. And this is number 59. And this is Venerable Sujato's translation. And I just clipped out the part at the very beginning, or pretty close to the very beginning, on the body or form. So when you read form or rupa, the translation of rupa, remember that it is all form, all different things that have, made up of the four elements. We're going to see that in a minute. Um, your phone and your car and your house, and your partner has a body, and your body, and all of that stuff falls into this category. So thus have I heard at one time the Blessed One was dwelling at Benares in the Deer Park. Then he addressed the group of 5 monks, said form, monks, the word here is bhikkhus, that's the Pali, is not self. So this is not a self. This is not, and we're going to get into, well, what did the Buddha mean by a self? But we can know that in our own experience. Who or what do I think I am, really? What is it that I identify with? And he's saying it's not the body. The body isn't you. If it were a self, then it wouldn't lead to affliction or suffering. So it's an interesting concept. What is a self? Here might contrast this or think of the idea of a soul that goes on through lifetime after lifetime, or goes to heaven or hell or whatever we think happens. Some lasting element that we can say is really me. And the Buddha says, the body's not it. And you should be able to say to something that's actually self, I want you to be this way. And then it becomes that you'd have control over it. This can be a concept that's hard to understand. Let my form be like this or not like that. Let my body be like this or not like that. But since we can't do that, and it leads to suffering, one is not able to say, let my form be like this or like that. It's not a self. It's not something to identify with. And if we think about how much we actually identify with the body, how concerned we are if the body becomes ill, or if it doesn't look the way we want it to look, or we know that it's going to die, and we feel like I'm losing myself. Sometimes I've seen people who it's very strongly recommended that they get some kind of surgery to remove some part of their body that's diseased. And they don't want to remove it because they feel like it's going to be losing some part of themselves. So the Buddha is really inviting us to recognize that this isn't the right stuff to identify with. It falls apart, and to identify with the body in this way just leads to enormous suffering. Yeah, Lisa?
Yes, this explanation is kind of puzzling to me. We were talking about it in Sutta study too, I think, and the explanation that why can't we change our physical body if that's ourself, and it could just kind of stumps me because yeah, I kind of rephrase it for myself in a different way. I'm not the owner of this body, because of course it's a collection of processes happening at, ongoing processes. And if I think I'm not the owner of this body, then it makes sense to me. I can't decide that I'm not going to be sick or that I'm not going to age. It's easier for me to understand that way.
Yeah.
For that.
That's helpful, Lisa. I think that's true. That's a really good way to think about it, especially, as we try to take these ways that the Buddha talks about things, and he will say something like that too in different places. And say, we don't own this body. And that's really helpful, because what I meant to say is, as we are trying to, what the Buddha says in the language that was really formed like 2,500 plus years ago, and apply it to our experience. Like, how does this really relate to me and how I think and what I'm experiencing? And I think that's excellent, because that's exactly correct. I don't own this body. Another thing that's been helpful, I think, is to think of it, it's on loan to me. You know, I mean, I can't make it be different than it is, and I can't keep it around longer. You know, it's kind of got an expiration date on it. I can't read it, but it's it's there somehow. I don't mean to be deterministic, but we know it's going to expire, and we can't stop it. Maybe we can make good choices to slow things down or to make our body more comfortable, but in the end, yeah, I don't own it. And they used to have T-shirts at Ajahn Chah's International Monastery with the words printing on the back, "No owner." So you see each other walking around like that, and you keep thinking, no, no owner. This collection of processes, you know, doing its thing. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. It's a really good way to look at it. So another thing that the Buddha often says about these 5 aggregates is, and here there's just the piece on form again, any kind of form at all, past, future, or present, internal, meaning like in my body, or external, meaning, you know, this computer, this microphone, whatever it is that's we've got handy, coarse or fine, so it's maybe like really heavy material, you know, like this, you know, physical, or it could be something more refined or energetic. It's still, if there's a form to it, maybe devas have a fine material body oftentimes, but it still falls into this category, inferior, superior, something we think is really beautiful, something we think is really coarse or ugly, crude, whatever, far away from us or near to us, it's all the same. It's something we can't really own. And to think that all these things we think we own, like a house or land, how can we own land? You know, it's a social convention to kind of keep things a little sorted out, but it's we can't really own anything. We're going to die and it's all going to go to somebody else. It's all on loan. And then this is a bit of a deeper description. The way the Buddha described form as something made up of the 4 primary elements, or derived from the primary elements of earth, water, air, fire, space, perhaps. Well, 4, so earth, water, fire, and air. And how does form come into being? Well, the body comes into being based on food. If you take the food away, the body can't keep going. And, you know, you could think of anything, does any material thing is based on some kind of conditions, that when those conditions cease to continue, then the thing falls apart. And the practice that leads to the cessation of form is simply the Noble Eightfold Path. So it's interesting to try to put that together. Like, how is my practicing of right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right immersion? How does that cause the cessation of form? And I think in a very practical sense, we don't get reborn because we see correctly. We've used the path to gain complete release from all clinging and suffering and all defilements. So there's no more arising of form in regard to this process. Can you think of any other way? Yeah, Neil?
I don't have an answer for your question, but I do have a question for you to answer. This paragraph is a little confusing to me, and I'm sure it just has to do with language, but form originates from food. When food ceases, form ceases. And then it says the Noble Eightfold Path leads to the cessation of form. So the Noble Eightfold Path and food and the cessation of,
Yeah.
it's, you see, I mean, the use of cessation in both of those examples doesn't seem related.
Yeah. Okay, so this translating this word as food is Bhante Sujato's translation. Bhikkhu Bodhi and Ajahn Nyanamoli would translate it as nutriment. And, you know, of course, why wouldn't food be nutriment and vice versa? But then you can think in a more broad sense of what might be the fundamental supporting conditions for a form to exist. Like maybe you could even look at geology, you know, how rocks form and how they disintegrate again. Maybe we can even look at how form and energy interchange, you know, that kind of stuff, to start to think more broadly that there are conditions that have to be in place for something, material thing, to exist. And, you know, you can take a piece of plywood and put it out in the sun and the rain. And those conditions that keep it together as plywood start to break down and degrade. And then it's not plywood anymore. And so I think that any kind of supporting conditions can be this idea of food. But it's still a leap to see how the practicing of this development of mind and the development of our character through right thinking, right speech, right action, right livelihood, developing of our understanding of reality, developing of meditation, how does that cause this to cease? It's coming at it from it's revealing a different angle. And that angle is the one that makes it possible for us to be free from suffering. That this process of body and mind isn't just material and it's not just logical. There's a spiritual element, the way the mind develops to a point where it lets go of clinging to all things that are impermanent. And when we let go of the clinging, that's the actual cessation. Yeah, the body ceases when there's no food, when you know, it can starve to death. I've even known of people, that's how they end their life. You know, refuse to eat.
So I guess I understand what you just said on some level, but I guess what's not connecting for me is that, so nutriment comes from food. If you
It's
take
one
away,
kind of nutriment. The Buddha
you,
identified more kinds. Even contact is nutriment.
I'm sorry, I meant form comes from nutriment.
Yeah.
So there's a negative aspect to this. If you take away the nutriment, you lose the form, or the form ceases.
Mm-hmm.
But then the next sentence puts a positive spin on cessation. You want cessation of form.
Yes. Oh, but your negative spin on it is only because of the way you think, of your clinging to form.
Okay, so all right, now that all right, that makes sense. I'm sorry if this
Oh no, this is great.
If
This is how we tease
else, I'm
the
sorry.
purpose.
Yeah, it feels like there needed to be a sentence between those two, the sentence you just said. Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That's good. Yes, Carrie and Jaime.
Yeah, so can I follow up on what Neil said? So my understanding of form is, well, that form is basically a construct, like a conceit, because actually there isn't form and everything is process. So from my reading of this, what they're calling food here, or whatever nutrient, is the thoughts that we have that make us have this delusion that form actually has substance. And so the Noble Eightfold Path practices are to help you understand that this does not have any substance. So that's so food isn't food. It's even just the thoughts that feed this conceit of self. And by practicing the Eightfold Path, eventually we come to this understanding of, oh, that's right, anatta. This is all just delusion. So that's my
Lovely.
reading of it. What do you think?
Yeah, nicely put. Yes,
Thank you.
it's a great way to look at it, and realistic. I mean, you know, there's these two levels that the Buddha said. There are these two levels. There's the material level where, you know, yeah, I have a body, it's sitting here, it's, you know, and there's the sort of kind of spiritual, otherworldly, you might say, looking at this from the perspective of what is really true. That form, it's not on the mundane level, it's not like it doesn't exist, but in reality, ultimately, it's, as you say, something of an illusion. So it's great, thank you. So then the Buddha goes into this other kind of template that he uses for describing and trying to tease apart our identification with things and why we are so wrapped up in stuff. And he talks about the gratification, the danger, or here it's translated as the drawbacks, and the escape. And we're probably going to see something of what Neil and Carrie were both getting at here in this. So the pleasure and happiness that arise from having form, that's the gratification. That's what keeps us wanting to exist and wanting to operate in the world and do what we do and have what we want and all that. And the fact that form is impermanent, and therefore when it changes, there is suffering if we're attached to it. It's perishable. That's the drawback. Or in some translations, they might say that's the danger of being wrapped up in form. Removing and giving up the desire and greed for form, that's the escape. And it comes through the cultivation of the Noble Eightfold Path in the very ways that, you know, we were just talking about, to see through it, to see the reality of it. Yeah. It's nice to be able to do things in a human body, and then if we're attached to that, we'll suffer. And it can be completely given up. And actually, what the Buddha keeps trying to help us see is that the removing and giving up of that desire and greed is also relief from suffering. It's not just the results of the form falling apart, but it's actually even in the desire to do things and have things and be things, that's already suffering. So those practitioners, ascetics and Brahmins, who directly know form in this way, how it arises, how it ceases, the practice that leads to its cessation, its gratification, drawback, and escape, they're practicing for the disillusionment, the dispassion, and the cessation regarding form. And they're practicing well. They have a firm footing in the teaching and the training. And then the next paragraph is almost the same. And they directly know form in this way, etc. And due to disillusionment. So they actually experience, they're not practicing for being disillusioned, dispassionate, and experiencing the sensation of clinging to form, but they actually experience it. Due to that, they're freed by not grasping. They're very well freed. And those are the ones who are fully enlightened. They're the ones who they don't go through the cycle of rebirth again. So that pretty much lays it out. You know, the Buddha says this in a lot of different ways, but that's the whole process. And then I know we're getting close to the end, but I have this sutta here about Nakula Pita, which I really love. It's the first one in the book of the Khandas, where I'll just kind of tell you the story. He's getting really old and he comes to the Buddha. I'm an old man, elderly and senior, and I'm advanced in years, etc. My body is ailing and I'm constantly unwell. I don't even get to come to see the mendicants so much anymore. And can you instruct me for my lasting welfare and happiness? And the Buddha says, it's really true. Your body is ailing, for this body is ailing, trapped in its shell. If anyone dragging around this body claimed to be healthy, even for a minute, what's that but foolishness? And we completely take this in, and it's like, man, that's the nature of the body. But he says, practice so that even though your body is ailing, your mind will be healthy. And then there's this interlude about how Nakula Pita gets up all happy, and then he sees Venerable Sariputta, and he tells Venerable Sariputta all about it. But Venerable Sariputta says, you really should have asked the Buddha what he meant by that. How do you do that? And then the Venerable Sariputta talks about it. So how do you do that? How is a person ailing in body but not ailing in mind? So an ordinary person, there's a bunch of stuff here about what defines an ordinary person who's not, heard these teachings. They think their body is self, or that the self has a body, so you're owning it, or that the body is in the self, or the self is in the body, something like that. Any of those ways of thinking of this eternal self related to the body. And we're obsessed with the thought, I am this form is mine. And when it decays and perishes, then we have sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and distress. And that's how we are both ailing in body and in mind. But then how can we be ailing in the body but not in the mind? So we've taken in this teaching, and we don't regard form as self. We don't think of it as me or mine. So when it falls apart, we don't have so much suffering. We don't have that sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and distress. So if you have a sense of what the practice is, just read in the chat. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, Carrie and Heine.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for one line you said. It's nice to be able to do things in a human body, but not be attached to that. It's like, yeah, thank you for that. We should just enjoy this. So thank you.
Yeah, and you'll know when you've crossed the line into being attached to it because you'll have suffering. And I think that's why the Buddha used that as the first noble truth. It's like we know when we've got this kind of imbalance and when we don't, because it's painful. Yeah, Neil?
So just toward the end there, a question came up in my mind, or a thought came up in my mind, and it might be too much to bring up in the last minute, but it occurs to me that the word anatta means not self, not no self. And I wonder if when we read that this is not, the body is not self, feelings are not self, but is the Buddha is not in fact saying there, whatever atta means, self is probably not the best translation because we have our own idea of what self means. It means, to me, it means my personality, but that's not self. So it seems to me the Buddha is saying there is something that is atta.
He is not saying that. In
It's
fact,
just that all those things are not that.
yeah, he specifically never really says there is a self or there is not. Well, I mean, okay, so there are places where he refuses to answer the question of whether
Right.
it's a self or not. You know, the Buddha never oversteps. And he can say for sure, and not that he doesn't know, but it's like you can really see that the body isn't self, nor our feelings, nor our thought processes and mental experience. That's all constantly changing. But when the Buddha talks about atta, he's talking on a material worldly level. Like let's see, is that quite true? It's the self. He talks about the self as the one who practices generosity. He talks about the self as the one who's practicing virtue. He talks about the self as an island unto itself. But that's really that that operation of being in the world as a living being. But when he talks about this everlasting ongoing self, the way he says it is what we have in morning chanting. All conditioned things are impermanent and all things are not self.
Right.
So that's not quite the same as saying, well, there's absolutely no such thing as self, but it certainly covers all the ground we can see.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Any final questions or comments?
You know, I guess I do have one more from
Okay.
way back at the beginning when Steve put his comment in the chat. I had a similar question. And
Making
it
those
didn't.
changes to the body, a
Yeah.
little surgery here and there, lose some weight.
Yeah, I mean, so that would seem to contradict the statements in the sutta. You know, if body is not self, then you wouldn't. If body was self, you'd be able to change it, but you can change it. I don't know if that's what Steve was getting at, but that was my question there too.
Yeah, and it's true that we can have some influence over it. It's like, we can quit smoking or change our diet when our health changes or something like that. And it can make a difference, but it's not going to keep you from dying. And it's not going to be like, oh, I don't want to be aging. yeah, you might look better if you get that plastic surgery, but it's not going to keep you from aging. You know, so I think that's really where it is. We have influence over things, you know, and the reason, and because we can make choices and actually train the mind, that's how we can awaken. We actually can become more virtuous and more loving and more I don't want to say generous in an incredible way of really having unconditional love. We can actually do this, but we're not going to keep from dying. Elisa?
Yes, I know we're already over time, but one thing I want to remember to bring up, maybe you could address it next time, is if we continue with this, the statement, we can be ailing in body but healthy in mind, just triggers a fear that I have, and I think a lot of people have, about losing mental faculties as we age, and dementia, or just not thinking clearly as we get closer to
Yeah.
death.
So here's the way I think about it. The part that starts to erode, that causes that mental confusion, is actually the brain. You know, there is a physical change happening. And if you like, for one, Ajahn Brahm tells stories about the mind separating from the body at death, and how someone who's been, unable to recognize anyone in their family for years, then they're suddenly, just before dying, able to talk to them, by name, call them by name, and talk very lucidly. And this often happens, I guess. And so the Ajahn Brahm says that he thinks the mind is separating from the body, and so it's not hampered by the way the brain is functioning anymore. And so, it's certainly the case that in Buddhism, the Buddha saw the chitta, the mind, as a separate thing from the body. And when you hear about people, the body dies and they can see the body, and they, maybe they're resuscitated and they come back to their body, and they can report on this, those near-death experiences. That would be the mind separating from the body. And sometimes people do this through practice, through meditation practice. The mind goes somewhere else. And so there is more going on than. So what if we have dementia? What if the mind? What if we have? It's like, whatever practice we've done, and who knows what kind of practice we can do. I saw the chat where, there's a lot of really present moment experience. And I don't know under what conditions we'll be able to continue to develop in our mental training. But I think we just work with whatever the conditions are at the time. Keep a good moral virtue and not worry at all about it. It's like, whatever comes, we're going to just do the best we can.
Yes, thank you. I guess we can take someone like Ram Dass as a good example. After his stroke, slowed down and couldn't even speak, but he stayed with his practice.
Yeah, I attended a talk of his in person after that happened, and he knew what he knew, and so anything can happen in this life, and it's really possible to learn how to let it go and be happy and free from suffering, because we really don't, own all this anyway.